Now become a matter of real urgency. 9-year-old Daniel Handley from Beckton in East London went missing sometime late in the afternoon of Sunday the 2nd of October. His mother was expecting him home by 6. He didn't turn up.
Daniel Handley was just 9 years old when he went missing while out riding his bike. It would later be learned that he was abducted and murdered in order to fulfill two men's perverted fantasies. And how does this murder case relate to Sidney Cook? Come with me right here in the Murder She Shed as we discuss this murder case and also rarely discuss true crime cases right here in my Murder She Shed, usually at least one time weekly. Make sure you hit that subscribe button in order to keep up with this gal right here, because a Southern gal sometimes gets lost in this big YouTube world. So if you don't hit the subscribe, you may never find me again. I'll just be lost in this world without you. As always, when we are discussing child cases, viewer discretion is advised. This is a rough one, just a warning. Daniel Handley had a rough life from the start. His mother, Maxine, had 5 kids, all of them boys. Daniel was the 4th. She had divorced their father, David, 10 months earlier, and now she is living with a much younger man named Alex Joseph. Alex could be violent, and Maxine and Alex would lay in bed all day just drinking alcohol. So Daniel learned at a young age in order to survive, he needed to take care of himself. He did odd jobs around London, such as washing windscreens at traffic lights, delivering papers, anything to turn a penny. 2 of Daniel's older brothers had already moved out of the house because of their mom's new man. One of Daniel's older brother had been attacked by Alex. When the brother had beat Alex on a video game, Alex became angry, threw him down, and just started kicking him all over. Daniel went to Beckton Cross Primary School and was one of those kids who talked to anyone. He already had girlfriends and was one of the little daredevils at school. Daniel was described as an energetic little boy who was streetwise. On October 2nd, 1994, Daniel had been playing with friends on his BMX bike and was told by his mother to return to their Beckton home in East London by 6 p.m. When he left his friends to head home, the chain actually fell off his bike. As he was bent over fixing the chain on his bike, he didn't notice 2 men slowing down their car because these men had found a boy just like the one they had been fantasizing about. One of those men was 31-year-old Tim Morse, who ran a flower shop called Green Fingers and was a taxi driver on the weekends. Tim was gay and lived with a 58-year-old man who had money, and this was how he was actually able to buy his own flower shop. This man, David Guttridge, owned the taxi cab place that Tim drove for. It was called Guy's Cars. Tim had a history of essaying children. 9 years earlier, on November 29, 1985, he had been jailed for 7 years for essaying 2 twin boys whom he was supposed to have been babysitting. The boys were 9 when the truth came out, and by that time, Tim had been essaying these boys for 4 years. Not only them, but slapping them to increase his pleasure. One of the boys had been his favorite. Tim had shared him with his best friend and had sat and watched as the boy was forced to submit. The other man in the car was 29-year-old Brett Tyler. Brett also worked part-time as a taxi cab driver. He was just in London for a short time until he could make enough money to move to the Philippines in order to live with his new boyfriend. His boyfriend was actually a Philippine national who was named Rolando Reyes, known as Raleigh. Brett had been attracted to the Philippines because of the easy access to children. While in the Philippines, Brett would pose as a priest and have phony religious services in his home. Brett had in his home recordings he had made while essaying some of these children that were supposedly coming for a church service. This wasn't the first time Tim and Brett had been driving around looking for a victim. Tim had been dwelling on this fantasy for years, and for years he had shared it with Brett ever since they had first met in a segregation wing of Wormwood Scrubs prison in West London. They had been sent there to actually protect them from other prisoners. Brett in particular had been badly beaten once his offense became known to other inmates. Brett had been in prison for subjecting a 9-year-old boy and his sister to 3 years of repeated. He had met the boy in the street and actually befriended him and then bribed him with money and sweets to cooperate with his desires. Then he had bribed the sister too. The two men had used their time together in prison to fuel each other's fantasies. It was in the same prison wing that Tim had actually met David Guttridge, who was to become his boyfriend. They were all kindred spirits. Guttridge, too, was in there for essaying children. 2 adolescent boys and a girl. He had had trouble with the oldest boy and had to beat him into submission. So he was serving time for actually causing bodily harm as well as for 7 counts of child abuse. But Guttridge was different in one way. He wanted to stop. He had been sent to jail only because he had gone to a psychiatrist and confessed, and had then followed his advice to begin this cure by going to the police. It had cost him his wife and children, who had left him and never spoken to him again. When the 3 of them were eventually discharged from Wormwood Scrubs, Guttridge went to group therapy at the psychiatrist's practice, and he slowly succeeded in controlling his passion for children. Guttridge tried to persuade Tim and Brett to do the same. Brett went once to therapy and then never went back. Guttridge didn't mind. He was jealous of Brett. He wanted Tim to himself. He wanted to cure Tim not only to protect children, but also so he could have him to himself. But Tim refused therapy. While Tim lived with Guttridge, he still would secretly set out to find children with Brett. One of Tim's victims was an 11-year-old son of a family friend. Tim worked on the boy slowly and deliberately, made friends with him, gave him gifts, told him secrets, held his hand, rubbed his back, until finally he had the boy believing that this was a natural thing to do. For years, Tim used him for sex and videoed himself in the act. Tim even shared the boy with Brett just so he could watch the 2 in the act. Although the 2 men had groomed plenty of boys for sex, this was not their ultimate fantasy. Their ultimate fantasy was to find a boy, aged about 9 or 10, with a slim build and blonde hair, and with no one looking after him, to abduct him, to rape him by force in front of a video camera, and finally to kill him and throw him away. Now on this cold, dark afternoon on Sunday, October 2nd, 1994, in Tolworth Road in the east of London, finally they agreed that they had found the right boy. Brett stepped out of the vehicle as Daniel looked up and noticed a man standing in front of him with a map and saying that he was lost. Right when they decided to throw Daniel into the car, a vehicle drove by. The family in the vehicle believed something wasn't right, so they passed and then turned back around. Tim and Brett saw them. Brett quickly thanked the boy on the bike and got back in the car. Daniel rode off toward his home, and the family were reassured that all was well after that. Tim and Brett, however, had enough of being frustrated. This was supposed to be the ultimate fantasy, the last taboo, and yet time and time again, when they went out on these hunting trips, they returned empty-handed. They decided that this night they would not return empty-handed. So they then began to follow slowly behind Daniel. They forced Daniel into the car and drove him to the taxi cab place Tim's lover owned, and kept Daniel in the flat upstairs while Tim went to find a video camera. They then took turns repeatedly raping the young boy while recording the whole time, so they could watch it later, supposedly. They then told Daniel that they would take him home, and they got back in the car, but instead they stopped at the home of Brett's father to pick up a garden fork and spade and set off down the road towards Bristol. They had thought about keeping him a prisoner to abuse him whenever they wanted, but they had nowhere to keep him, and they had been afraid that Guttridge would find out and betray them. So instead, they then drove Daniel to a rest stop where they raped him again. Afterwards, taking out a rope, which prompted Daniel to ask, "Are you going to kill me now?" They then put the rope around Daniel's neck and together strangled him to death with the rope. They dumped his body in a shallow grave near a golf course close to Tim and Guttridge's home. 2 weeks later, they returned to the body, dug it up, pulled Daniel's body out of the grave, and dug the hole deeper, and then threw his body back in the grave. They had been paranoid that an animal would dig the body up because it had been buried so shallow. Brett decided it was time to make his way back to his lover's home in the Philippines, while Tim just continued living with Guttridge. When Daniel had not returned by 10:30 that night, his mom Maxine called the police. The police investigator Ed Williams had divers in the river and the docks and the tidal basins. His men searched wastelands and warehouses, and they started visiting the homes of known pedophiles in the area. They found nothing. The evening of the abduction, 2 boys actually found an abandoned silver BMX bike, and it was only around the corner from Daniel's house. The boys took it back home, where they wiped it down and thought to keep it. When they heard of the missing boy, though, they gave the bike to the police, who found that it was Daniel's bike. As always, when a child goes missing, Williams began looking at Daniel's family, thinking they could have been involved. There are stories of bizarre activities of Daniel's mother, Maxine, routinely having sex in her bedroom with her boyfriend, Alex, knowing that local children were watching through holes in the door. And he also heard of other adults visiting the house for groups. He also knew Alex was violent, and he discovered that Alex had previously had fantasies about killing children. On December 14, 1994, Williams arrested Maxine and Alex. His officers questioned them both closely about Daniel's disappearance. Maxine soon persuaded them that she was telling the truth. Williams was not sure about Alex, but a psychiatrist who examined him concluded that he was far too simple-minded to be able to concoct and sustain a complicated lie, and so he must be telling the truth. Williams accepted that they had done nothing to Daniels, but they were charged with gross indecency with children, assault, and neglect. On March 27, 1995, 6 months after Daniel's disappearance, a social worker who was out with his dog looking for rabbits near a golf course came across what appeared to be a human skull. When police came and cut back the grass, they found a bright red jumpsuit with "Champion" written across it, and they called Ed Williams. Daniel's dental record confirmed that this was his skull. There were 26 other small bones buried nearby. Not long after finding Daniel's body, Detective Williams received a very interesting call from a psychiatrist whose wife had seen the Daniels case on a crime show. He said he wanted the police to know that he had once had a patient who had come to a group therapy session and boasted of his fantasies to abduct and murder a boy of Daniel's age. This man had been so callous that the psychiatrist had never forgotten it, and even though he had a duty not to disclose what his patients told him, he had wrestled with his conscience and decided that on this occasion he had to say something. He was particularly worried, he explained, because this man lived in the area where the body had been found, and his name was Tim Morse. Detective Williams checked on Tim Morse's background and saw his conviction for child abuse. He discovered that he was driving taxis in London near where Daniel lived and living in Bradley Stokes near where he was buried. On May 30th, Ed Williams' team arrested Tim Morse and David Guttridge in London. 2 weeks later, his men also arrested Brett Tyler in the Philippines. All 3 men confessed. Guttridge filled in more of the picture. He told Williams' team how 8 months earlier, Tim had seen police talking about his car on that crime show and had confessed to him that he and Brett had been involved, how he had refused to believe the truth even though Tim had kept repeating his confession, how Tim had lost his head when Daniel's body was found and begged him to help him escape, and how he had given money to Tim in order to fly to the Philippines with Brett until the pressure died down. The police even went to Brett's home in the Philippines and searched it, and they made another disturbing find. Brett had adopted 2 young children, a boy whom he had named Brett Tyler Jr., and a girl whom he had named Jeanette. They were members of a local tribe whose village had been devastated by a volcano. Their parents apparently had died during the eruption, and Brett had been allowed to adopt them without any kind of supervision and to keep them in his home. Now, doctors who examined them reported that both of them had been. The boy denied that his father had been responsible. The girl said nothing. She had been struck deaf and mute by the death of her family. She was a perfect victim. Both men were sentenced to life in prison by the judge until in 2002 the Home Secretary decided it was cruel for those monsters to serve life and sentenced them to 50 years. One of the most interesting facts that I learned while researching this case was that from the onset, Detective Williams considered the possibility that the men who had abducted Daniel might actually be linked to the Operation Orchid inquiry in the mid-1980s when police found that a network of pedophiles had abducted and murdered boys from the East End of London. One of the men linked to Operation Orchid was Sidney Cook. Cook was part of a horrifying ring known as the Dirty Dozen, which traded in the young boys in the 1980s and was suspected in several murders. But when Ed Williams tried to consult the Orchid files, he ran into complete confusion. He said, "What has happened to all the intelligence from Orchid?" The answer was nothing. No one had been responsible for analyzing it. No one had done anything with it. It was supposed to be on a database somewhere. He spent hours and hours trying to get a hold of the original reports. The intelligence branch CO11 told him it had been wiped. They just didn't have it. And then by sheer luck, it turned out that one of their typists in the station had worked on Orchid, and she knew where to find some of it. Months later, Williams eventually discovered that there are indirect links between the Orchid and Daniel's attackers. They had used the same technique to abduct young boys, carrying a map and asking directions. Both groups had carried tranquilizers, such as temazepam, that was found in the bodies of two of the Orchid victims. Tim and Brett also recorded the just like members of the Cook gang did. The video recording of Daniel's was never found, and according to Tim and Brett, it was destroyed. Do you think it was really destroyed or sent to other men in this group so they could watch it too? Williams later discovered that both of the guilty men had the chance to borrow techniques from the Orchid killers because one of their friends was a offender who had shared a prison cell with one of the Orchid, Sidney Cook. Detectives at the time of Cook's arrest investigated links between Cook's group and the Elm Guest House in Barnes, where a lot of the boys had taken place. It is alleged politicians and other VIPs attacked and children there, but they supposedly could not find a link. Another Williams, Malcolm, who was connected to Sidney Cook's gang, was a neighbor of Daniel Handley's brother in 2000 when he was shot and killed. The police said Malcolm's killing bore the hallmarks of a professional hit, and two white males were seen running away. Interesting enough, Malcolm was getting ready to expose a major child sex ring, including several influential figures, police believed. A report in a Mirror News article from February 2013 claimed that the VIP ring involving Jimmy Savile, a former Tory cabinet minister, and some judges and other MPs were linked to Cook, who provided them with children to. Was Malcolm about to expose these men and many more before he was murdered? Malcolm's killers were never found. All right, guys, maybe next time we will dig deeper into all the connections of this ring. See y'all next time at the Murder She Shed. I love y'all. Thanks for all the support. Thanks to you guys, our Murder She Shed is now filled with almost 13,000 people and growing daily. I'm not sure how many more I can fit into this Murder She Shed, though. Seems like it's just a lot of people to fit in here. I don't know. Anyway, like I said, I love you guys, and thank you for everything you've done and for supporting my channel. Have a great day, and I'll let you say bye to Simon, and I think Max might still be in here. Max, you want to tell him bye? Come here, tell him bye. This is Max. He's actually in here with me again instead of Daddy. I don't know why. But where's your brother? Where's your brother, Big? Oh, there he is. He knew I was talking in here, Simon. He gonna come up front again. He thinks he's supposed to be up front in the camera all times. And blur out Max. He's real needy like that. Anyway, we'll let you go. We'll see you next time. Oh, yes, we're gonna go do something. Yes, we're gonna go do some fun. You ready to go do something?
I love everything. Fire spreading all around my room. My world's so bright, it's hard to breathe, but that's alright. Hush.